Hey everyone. First off, we at The Familiar Strange want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're recording this podcast and pay our respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, past, present, and emerging. Let's go. Hello and welcome to The Familiar Strange. I am Ian Pollock, your familiar stranger today. Welcome to the podcast, brought to you with support from the Australian Anthropological Society, the Schools of Culture, History and Language, and Archaeology and Anthropology at Australian National University, the Australian Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, and produced in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Episode 15. 6 months at The Familiar Strange, over 10,000 downloads on the podcast, over 40,000 views at thefamiliarstrange.com. I hope you feel like you've gotten to know us, your familiar strangers, a little bit. That's me, Ian, plus Julia Brown, Simon Theobald, and Jodie Lee Trembath, 4 PhD candidates in anthropology at Australian National University. Making The Familiar Strange is work. It's not always easy, but we think that it's worth it. I hope that you think so too. The Familiar Strange is a podcast about doing anthropology, alternating between group discussions where we spark 4 little anthropological discussions in about 20 minutes, and longer conversations with experts and senior academics about how they do anthropology. If you like what you hear, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend, a colleague, a classmate. Say hi or argue back on Twitter at TFS Tweets or on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We're everywhere. Now, my conversation with Vijayendra Rao, lead economist at the World Bank in the research department, author of countless books and articles, and a leader of the World Bank Social Observatory focused on raising the capacity of regular citizens for collective action and making government and big development more responsive. I caught Dr. Rao after a talk he gave about the Social Observatory at the Development Policy Center here at ANU. That talk was recorded also, and you can find a link in the show notes. Now, he's not an anthropologist, but he works with anthropologists, and he has a lot to say about how anthropologists work in big-time development and what it's like to work with us. That kind of development, a lot of it is direct interventions, going to places and communities where people are poor or disempowered and trying to change things, working out a science of deliberate social change with experiments and monitoring and a lot of money behind it. Big, powerful institutions trying to change culture and social structure. I can safely say not all anthropologists are on board with this. My colleagues, when I told them I booked this interview, they told me to be super hostile and make him answer for everything they don't like about the development industry. On the other hand, full disclosure, I've done a little bit of consulting for the bank. Maybe I'd like to do a little bit more. I guess I tried to balance those two sides. When I did this interview, it was tempting to try and make my questions stand in for all of anthropology and make his answers stand in for all of development. But I'm an individual, he's an individual, laying out a point of view. If you're an anthropologist or studying anthropology, where do you stand on these big, powerful institutions set on certain kinds of social change? Give it some thought. We talk about how ethnography fits into interdisciplinary research, the need for all kinds of dialogues to be co-produced between development agencies and the state, the so-called beneficiaries on the ground, and between implementers and researchers, the search for global best practices versus acknowledgement that social systems are all local, and what bugs him most about anthropologists and where he wishes we would contribute. Quick note on terms, we talk about RCTs, which are randomized controlled trials, a method of running large-scale social experiments. So, here it is, my conversation with Vijayendra Rao. So, you're an economist, but you seem to be sort of a champion in the World Bank and in the development world for anthropology or for kind of ethnographic field methods. I wondered what brought you to that.
I'm not a champion of anything. I'm a champion of common sense, in the sense that I think divides between disciplines are an artifact of sort of path-dependent history. And those divides, as you know, are not just theoretical, they're also methodological. And they tend to select out certain types of people in some discipline or the other. If you're good at math, you go one place or whatever. Which I think does a disservice to policymaking, because it's very silly to, for instance, do an impact evaluation using some randomized controlled trial method and not do a deep ethnography to understand why you got the results you got. Just seems such an obvious integration of things.
All right, so let's walk that back for a second. Randomized controlled trial. Can you just talk about how that works for a second?
A randomized controlled trial is a method borrowed from public health and from medicine and so on. It's basically how all drugs are tested, right? You randomly assign a new drug, for instance, You pick a population, you randomly pick people with say the population consists of people with a particular ailment. And then from that population, you'll pick a certain percentage to get the treatment, and another group gets a placebo. The explicit aim of RCTs was to bring the science of medical trials into development.
And so then you were talking about bringing kind of another ethnographic side to that?
The role of ethnography, and by that I don't mean what they call, qualitative work, which can really be, touch the water buffalo kind of stuff. You go to the and people really think they do focus groups, they've done qualitative work. So there's that other extreme of real crap that goes on. And the World Bank, like every other organization, is beset by that. It's in absence of rigorous data from whatever discipline, they just get stories to justify whatever narrative they want to push.
So when you're talking about ethnography, you're not talking about, you call it kind of non-rigorous, just stories.
No, I'm talking about serious stuff. I'm talking about serious, whatever discipline you might come from, whether it's sociology or anthropology or political science, they all have their standards for what good qualitative research is. So I'm talking about serious stuff, right?
Okay.
So I'm not an advocate of ethnography as such. As I said, I'm an advocate of using the right method to ask the right question. Yeah, and I'm also believe very strongly that one method alone is not going to give you the right answer to whatever question you may have. Yeah. So, for instance, I just finished a paper. I just published a paper where we, in fact, did a randomized control trial of a citizenship training program in northern Karnataka in India. And what we did there was we picked 50 villages where all of these villages are part of this Indian system of local government with democratic elections and so on. But we assigned 50% of those villages on a random basis, an intensive engagement in an NGO that sort of activated citizens, taught them how to plan, got them to engage in village meetings, to think about issues, come up with priorities and so on. And 50% of the villages basically had whatever went on there. They were, quote unquote, the control group. Now, that trial found that the citizenship training program had no impact. So that was a quantitative result. Mm-hmm. But with the 10% subsample, that is 5 villages treatment, 5 villages control, we tracked them with field investigators for a period of 6 years. So the randomized control trial just was a 2-year gap. The qualitative work went on for 6 years.
6 years?
6 years. Over 20 villages. Yeah. So I had basically 10 field investigators living either in those villages or nearby, and they would send us monthly reports. Their brief was your investigative reporters. Yeah, don't interfere in anything that goes on there. Don't act as activists or anything of that sort. Just report on everything you see, politics, sociology, economics going on in those villages.
And those are just narrative reports?
Those are narrative reports covering certain issues that we agreed on. So those monthly reports over a 6-year period. So we had 10 monthly reports, 2 villages in each report over a 6-year period in treatment and control. So the voluminous amount of narratives that come from that, that's our qualitative database.
Who's then reading that?
Us. So the researchers, right? Mm-hmm. Me, Kripa Anandpur, my co-author, who's a sociologist at the Madras Institute for Development Studies. We read through all that. And also made visits ourselves, obviously. Kripa much more frequently than me, but I went at least twice a year. She would go several times a year, both to supervise as well as to visit. And what we found was something very interesting, that the reason why this didn't work was because some of those impacts were coming much later. They didn't happen in the period of the trial. Trajectories of change are unpredictable, and something can happen because of this. Some citizen, it takes a long time to get something done. A local activist, starting a mini social movement of some kind, doesn't have an effect till after 4 years. That was one thing. The second thing was the very, very bad quality of facilitation. The fact that the top higher levels of government had no interest in this. So they were kept shifting facilitators from one village to another. They were not giving them the time to do their work.
So facilitators are the people who on the ground implement the program, is that
Precisely,
right?
yeah.
So you had some will coming from the development agency,
yeah,
but much weaker will in the government that then translated into poor administration at the coalface?
Exactly, yeah. So that was the second reason why this didn't work. And the third reason why it didn't work was, what this program did was that it was taking ideas developed in the state of Kerala, which is very progressive, sort of left-oriented state in India. It's well known for doing well on a whole bunch of indicators, and bringing it to the neighboring state of Karnataka, but the northern part of Karnataka, which is a very feudal, very dry area. And the social context produced by that sort of geography and that sort of history made it very, very difficult. Deep control by elites, lots of guns and violence, it's very difficult to make social change happen in those kinds of places. And you saw those narratives picking that stuff up. Sometimes reads like a Western novel, some of the narratives that came from there. What we then did was to put, I think for the first time, this randomized control trial report with the ethnography into one paper.
What was that paper called?
It's called The Anatomy of Failure. And they gave us a revise and resubmit, but they wanted us to cut the paper down to 10,000 words.
How long was it when you sent it in?
17.
Yeah. As somebody who reads papers all the time, I have some sympathy with that.
Well, yes, but if you're going to combine hardcore quantitative analysis with hardcore qualitative analysis, you need the time, you need the space. But the second thing is they wanted us to essentially make the qualitative work into the equivalent of a quantitative database.
Quantitative database?
In the sense that you put everything online, and then every time you do a quote, you sort of give the paragraph number and so on, so people can just go and cross-check. I have some sympathy for that. I think it's important for qualitative research, ethnographic field reports, and that sort of thing to be archived, to be publicly accessible. So is that saying that, like,
when you have, say, an interview with an informant, you would put that entire interview online?
That's what they wanted.
See, I feel that would go against the ethics protocols that we do here for our PhD work.
Well,
we have to keep our data private.
So there are confidentiality issues which you can get around. You can change names, you can change context, but then the problem with that is when you change names, change context. How do you do the interpretive work?
Right.
So that becomes the contradiction. But the principle is essentially a good one. Because we know, going back to Margaret Mead, that people make up stories.
They sure do.
So how do you prevent that from happening? As social scientists, we're not writing novels. We are trying to represent, quote unquote, the truth in some way. So how do you cross-check that? And what's happened in the quantitative social sciences is that now all data is supposed to be up and freely available. So and that's new, by the way. It's in the last 5 years that has happened. So anybody can cross-check that, replicate it, and so on. And it's really introduced a very healthy change, I think. So they were pushing us in that direction. Mm-hmm. And, we weren't ready for that. If we were prepared for that from the time of the study design, then we could have done something. But ex post, it becomes very hard. Yeah. The world isn't ready, I think, for that sort of mixed methods paper in a serious way yet.
Why is the world not ready for it? What does that mean?
We're still ruled by disciplines. So, for instance, who's going to referee a paper like this?
Right.
I mean, you need a very well-trained econometrician. On the one hand, what are you going to make of the qualitative work? I used to be on the editorial board of something called the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. It's now defunct. The thing with that journal, and the reason I think it went defunct, is that the quality of the work was weak on both quantitative and qualitative. But when it's good on both qualitative and quantitative, then it has to be read by referees who can appreciate what's good about it. Which means they've got to completely understand, they're going to come from a completely different mindset to the part of the thing that's not their own. And that creates some issues. So which journal do you send it to?
You keep coming back to a theme I'd like to bring up now, which is kind of an idea of seriousness and rigor in social science research. I'd like you to say a little more about what it means for that kind of work to be serious. What counts as serious and rigorous and what doesn't?
To me, work that doesn't satisfy the internal standards of a discipline in a way that, obviously all standards in some ways are arbitrary, but they come for a reason. They're there for a reason. When it doesn't satisfy those standards, it's not rigorous work. Yeah, so rigor, I define rigor according to the discipline in which you're working. Now, when you're crossing disciplines, that becomes an issue. What is rigorous across a discipline when you're working on different methodologies? We still have to evolve standards for what that is. But in development, which is an area that I'm not talking about development studies, I'm talking about development practice. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of qualitative work done, a lot of quantitative work done that doesn't meet standards of rigor from any discipline. There's also a lot of great work that meets wonderful standards of rigor, right? So, because the imperative is not scholarship. The imperative is either some sort of packaging or, selling a product or getting funders interested or whatever. In the World Bank many years ago, there used to be something called beneficiary assessments that were done all the time. That is, you went and you tried to look at the impact of a project by talking to beneficiaries. And the purpose is perfectly valid. But when you're talking to quote-unquote beneficiaries, think of the way that logic is going to work. Who's going to talk to you? Those who benefited from the project, not from those who don't. Which means you're going to get this very rosy narrative of happy stories.
Right. I think just in my own sort of development studies here, but reading David Moss, Cultivating Development.
Which is a wonderful work. That's what I call rigorous research.
His discussion is a lot about how kind of that narrative of a success is something that's produced between, you could call them beneficiaries, you could call them citizens, participants, something that's produced between them and the development practitioners.
Exactly.
It's a discourse that comes up together.
Correct. And that to me is crap.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was at a talk of yours just earlier today.
Yes.
But one thing you talked about there was the importance of co-producing discourse.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Co-producing is an old idea which in development studies that goes back at least 30, 40 years. goes back to Paulo Freire, I guess, even further than that. But the idea basically is that it's the notion of the expert, right? That we kind of know what's good and we go and fix things. And I think anthropology dismissed that a long time ago. But how do you do interventions? I mean, you're trying to get away from the idea of the expert. Now, what that means is that basically you come to a common understanding of those who are supposed to be receiving the help and those who are supposed to be giving the help as to what that nature of that help should be and how it should be managed and how it should be assessed. How do we change that? Yeah, and ideally you change that by engaging in a real conversation, a real dialogue, a sort of a dialogic process, if you want to use those words, as to what that form of assistance should take and what they should do with it and how it should be assessed. Yeah, I mean, because everything is getting evaluated nowadays. So who should do the evaluation? What does that mean?
So we're talking about creating goals for some kind of change.
Creating goals for change, creating processes to achieve those goals so that it leaves something behind and it doesn't just leave some money, which can be very badly misused. Yeah. How do you make that change happen? How do you make it happen over the long term? That requires, in my mind, a process of co-production. It's a process of dialogue. Yeah. So it's how do you bring dialogue into interventions is really what I think our goal should be as development practitioners, as development researchers even, which is not yet the common practice.
What is the common practice?
Common practice is a design of an intervention that typically comes up because somebody else has done it somewhere and has claimed great success for it. And you say, okay, something worked in Indonesia, let's go try it in India, or vice versa. I did a book 5 years ago called Localizing Development, where one of the things we did in these CDD projects, community-driven development projects, which the bank at that point had spent $80 billion on.
That was the buzzword in Indonesia the whole time I was there.
Yeah, so that amount of money, what we expected to find was that when these projects were designed, they would be very contextually designed. At least you would wonder about the political economy of the country. You try to assess the sociology, the social structures that you're working with. How would you, and in Indonesia, they actually did that with the KDP project. But that was the exception. For the most part, what we found was people were cutting and pasting projects done in Malawi with projects done in Morocco. I'm not kidding, We did a text analysis of those project appraisal documents, which are the design documents. And basically they found, in academia, we'd call them plagiarized, but of course there's no plagiarism. They were cut and paste jobs, which means they were not caring about context. These were not coming up in a process of dialogue. These were essentially designs coming up with experts designing what these things were and hire a consultant, put it all together as a package and sell it to the bank or whoever else. By the way, it's not just the bank that's guilty of it. Everybody's guilty of this.
Sure, yeah. And people are looking for global best practices everywhere they
go. And the notion of a best practice is the most unhealthy thing in development.
You say that best practice is an unhealthy thing in development. Unhealthy is an interesting word because it seems like a lot of the language we've been using so far is a language of medicine.
Yeah, and more so.
It's becoming and of engineering as well. What are the kind of dominant metaphors that people are using?
Medical. Entirely medical now. Randomized control trials. So that's a medical metaphor. You find people who sort of first came up with the idea of randomized control trials explicitly saying that we need to make development like medicine. So that's not even a hidden metaphor. It's an explicit metaphor. But, metaphors are short forms, right? They help us. In a world of policy, you can't spend too much time going on about, I know you anthropologists go on about where you came from, what you did, why you are where you are. I've gone to many AAA meetings and gone bored out of my mind listening to those sorts of speeches. Because you need to get to the point. You're in the real world. There's a time constraint. You have to get through. So I understand metaphors are shortcuts. They're helpful. They also result in a way of thinking and being and doing that sometimes can be unhealthy. We get that. Yeah.
One of those things being, just thinking of medicine from a Western perspective, the idea that all human bodies will work along similar mechanisms.
Yeah, now that's a bad metaphor.
Which is not like there are many other medical systems in the world that assume that all bodies are different from each other.
So, no, let's stay with that point. Because I think with that statement, you've pinpointed what to me is the single biggest problem in development with the RCT approach and with others. There's nothing wrong with an RCT. I do RCTs, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with an RCT. It's a very important technique. It's a technique because it allows you to get at some understanding of the causal effect of an intervention, right? And the best way we know how as human beings to assess causality is a randomized control trial, right? With a large sample. So it's a necessary technique, method. But it results in a culture of development that then sort of assumes, medical trials assume that human beings are basically have the same body systems. Right? That's why drugs come up the way they do.
And that a drug that works in America should work on Chinese bodies the same way it works on American bodies.
That's the assumption. I mean, slowly they're getting out of that, but that certainly is the assumption. And that's now coming into development. Not just that, when you're actually testing a drug, like one of the first RCTs was done with deworming medicine. To me, it's not a very wrong assumption to think the deworming medicines going to work the same way on me as it works on you. Yeah, even though we have different genetic makeups and so on. Yeah, but a community-driven development project that's trying to get us to engage as citizens, if you were sitting in Canberra and I'm sitting in Madras or someplace in India, Chennai, is not going to work the same way. Yeah. So when you're doing an RCT with that assumption in mind of this sameness of social structure, that creates a problem. If the social structure is the big thing you need to work with. So in fact, when these projects are done well, they're very contextualized to the village at hand, which means that you really can't effectively do a randomized control trial on them. So what happens with this sort of thinking is that those are what you might call complex interventions. Complex interventions start getting driven away, just as medical practice on allopathic medicine, which does randomized control trials on drugs, has been tremendously effective finding drugs for all kinds of things, but has driven away more contextualized form of medicine. Ayurveda, or chiropractic, or whatever else, are considered inferior forms because they cannot be quite subject to the kind of randomized control trial results. So it's a new sort of ideology of what makes change possible.
And there's a sort of hierarchy of these knowledges, right, depending on the method you use to get them?
Yes, there's definitely a hierarchy depending on the method, and quant is better than qual. I think there's something intrinsically wrong about that. Now, by the way, I'm been critical of the quant types. I'm also going to be critical of the qual types, anthropologists and others.
Yeah, lay it on us.
So I'm going to lay it on you. The huge resistance to numbers. Yeah, I mean, I remember giving a talk at SOAS where my friend David Moss works, and saying something about poverty measurement. And so this guy from Latin American grad student comes up to the stage and starts going into a 20-minute discourse of how numbers are evil. Numbers are not evil. They're just things. Yes, they are produced. I mean, there's too much Foucault in your lives, I think.
There's too much Foucault in everybody's lives.
So I think we need to get to a post-structuralist point where we're not constantly interrogating everything. Sometimes things are necessary to do because when you're doing large interventions, which are going to happen, you have to assess them. You have to do surveys. You have to collect survey data. That's not evil. That's just necessary. Yeah, all survey data have their problems, have their issues. And I think it's time anthropologists looked at survey data, just as economists should be looking at qualitative information from your own disciplinary lens. Yeah.
So you still find a lot of resistance from anthropologists to working in the development world or working with development instruments?
Oh, no, I don't find resistance. Anthropologists would love to work in the development world. They just don't have opportunities.
Well, that's another issue I want to get to in a second. One of the kind of tropes out there is that development is anthropology's evil twin, and it goes into the same places that anthropologists work and researches the same sorts of people, and then rather than sort of cataloging and creating that taxonomy of human difference and protecting human difference, it's about creating change towards a sort of homogeneity and sameness.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I can respond to it in many different ways. I will remind you of the history of anthropology and of apartheid, but I don't have to do that in this context. There is a danger towards categorizing cultures and trying to fix them and trying to manipulate them. Yeah, I think that danger is coming once again into the world today because people think they can fix cultures. Yeah, a lot of papers written on this by a lot of economists. Norm changes.
Norm change. That's the term that economists use, norms instead of culture, or also culture?
Also culture. It's used a lot by a lot of economists. The problem is that the complex debates around cultural change and trying to induce cultural change or norm change that anthropologists have been debating for a very, very long time are not part of the economist lexicon. They don't read that stuff, right? So they're not coming to it with the sort of sophisticated understanding that an anthropologist would with all the training that they've had. Yeah. But what anthropologists do that bugs the heck out of me is critique. Be constructive for a change.
I did. So doing a little bit of anthropological work in the World Bank in Indonesia, I did come to feel that the role of the anthropologist in development is to say why nothing will ever work.
It seems wrong to me. Why can't an anthropologist learn how to contribute towards design, learn how to contribute towards processes of co-production, learn how to make human beings actually matter in the process by which decisions are made, work towards those things.
Is that something that's lacking, making human beings matter?
Human beings matter with their agency intact. Yes, that is lacking. It's not done very well. Some years ago, I did a book called Culture and Public Action with Mike Walton. We edited a volume, and wonderful people wrote in it: Amartya Sen, Arjuna Padre, even the great late Mary Douglas. It was one of the best experiences of my life.
That's a great list.
Yeah, if you've not read the book, you should. One of the things we did there was that we tried to say that what economists obsess about is equality of opportunity. The idea of having a level playing field on material stuff, education, health, and so on, which is, of course, centrally important. But he said what they miss is equality of agency. Yeah. So we need to worry both about equality of opportunity and equality of agency. How do we make equality of agency happen? How do we bridge those discriminatory boundaries that exist in the world?
How do you define agency in this context?
Capacity to speak and to be listened to. That's it. Yeah. And we know that there's a lot of difference in that. There's enough evidence to show us that. How do we make that happen in development? That's where anthropologists can come in. By thinking through those issues in a creative way. There was an old trope that used to go on when I was a kid called appropriate technology. Which I still believe in greatly. And I think if technology is used appropriately, it works very well.
What does appropriate technology mean?
Where you're not falling for the method, but for what you can do with the method in order to make human agency possible.
What do you mean?
Well, let me tell you what I'm doing. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to give the ability to citizens, you saw this in the talk I just gave, to collect and analyze their own data. That is, why should access to data be the province of the expert? So how do we give it back to citizens? So we're using technology in two different ways. Developing tablet-based survey systems that anybody can use, so it becomes very easy to collect the data. And secondly, we're using very sophisticated systems of visualization, sort of like an iPhone where all the technical stuff is at the back, but at the user end, it's very easy to do, where the visualizing the data, it becomes co-produced so that even an illiterate person kind of see a picture and understand what the data are telling them. Yeah, and that's technology. India has village democracy all over the country. It's the 73rd Amendment to the Indian Constitution that was passed in 1992, which basically legislates, mandates that every Indian village should belong to a village, to have a village council, with the president, a vice president, and members who are elected in an independently managed election every 6 years. And 1/3 of all presidencies, 1/3 of all village council seats are reserved for women. Proportion is reserved for Dalits, that is underprivileged castes. And that's the executive part of the village government. The legislative part is everybody. Every citizen of the village belongs to something called a Gram Sabha, a village forum. We are trying to give data to make the Gram Sabha more informed about its conditions. So when citizens look at data about their village that they have had a part in collecting and even thinking through what questions to ask, then they're able to assess how to spend their money and come to some sort of agreement about what resources. So it's not just about arguing about facts. The facts they have produced themselves. Okay, and it's not me as a trained economist having done a survey and throwing facts at them. These are their own facts. Yeah, and we've seen that it makes a huge difference. So that's what I mean.
How does it make a difference?
The Gram Sabha is at the end a deliberative body where people are trying to come to some sort of collective decisions. And oftentimes what happens in a Gram Sabha is that you're arguing about facts. My part of the village is worse off than yours. You have more water than me. You have more of this than that. I need the resources for this. Those facts now can't be disputed because everybody has the same facts. Then, having seen those facts, you can argue on priorities based on other things, that would matter, how you weigh this part of the village to that or whatever. Yeah. So it facilitates deliberative decision-making, community-level decision-making. That's one way. Second thing is that it creates a counter-narrative to top-down visions of data, in the following sense. In India and many other parts of the world, every part of the world, the poor are counted via survey systems that are developed by some statistical office. Mm-hmm. And you're told that what this proportion of people living below $1 a day or something. There are many problems with that. One problem is the unidimensionality of it. The second problem is it is a narrative produced by the government, by the state. Yeah. Here, the nature of who is poor, what living standards are, is developed by citizens themselves. So it's a counter-narrative to that. You say we are poor, but you see we are not poor, but look at our living conditions. We have data to show you what these things are. So that counter-narrative results in a very different kind of more equal dialogue on policy.
But at the same time, this is a parallel system of fact creation to one from the state, which then it disputes.
Ideally, you want the state to buy into the system of data collection, which is what has happened in the state of Tamil Nadu. The government of Tamil Nadu is very excited by this system, and they want us to develop this throughout the state so that both citizens and them can agree on the same facts. You see? Because it gives them data that's very different from the kind of data they already have. Yeah. So in some ways, we hope this will change the dialogue on policy making in poor areas. And that's really what I hope this happens with this. We don't know whether it'll go that far, but we're just starting on these things.
It seems like with participatory or community-driven development, things like that, development agencies are often sort of setting up parallel institutions to the state or picking up slack in areas where they feel the state is deficient, and then perhaps hoping that the state will pick them up. Do you encounter a lot of resistance from government, in particular, with sort of taking over their positions, or hope that the government can continue to externalize all of those things to you?
For the most part, it's the governments who are coming up with these programs themselves. I mean, they understand what the bank does or anybody else does, and then sort of the ideas floating in the air that they come up with, but they're coming up with these things themselves.
The idea is floating in the air?
It's floating in the air. I mean, CDD floats in the air, somebody writes. I mean, it's all...
We could get in a minute to sort of the faddishness and the quality of ideas floating in the air.
I think it's a very...
It seems to be in 10-year waves, whether things come up from the bottom or down from the top.
I think 10 years is exactly right, yes. But the point I'm making about this is that these parallel systems are part of the political economy of the particular government that is doing the project. Sometimes it's being pushed by institutions like the bank and by USAID or DFAD or all people like that. But sometimes they're coming from the government themselves. Yeah, I think it's terribly unhealthy, personally, for two reasons. One reason that it's unhealthy is that it doesn't result in a slow process by which, say, local government is strengthened. But you're creating these parallel institutions, say, of self-help groups, which are not connected to local government. Ideally, if you were going to create self-help groups, you would want them coordinated with the local government so that they work together, and the best projects do that.
So there's still an idea, an end goal of a strong state?
Yeah, the end goal is of a more effective state, yes. Yeah, and the fact that you would ask the question makes me wonder about anthropology. You don't like effective states?
Anthropology doesn't like anything.
That's my problem, isn't it? I mean, so anthropologists are trained nowadays.
I mean, so take for instance something you brought up earlier about how economists really want equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And anthropologists, of course, are looking at culture, and many cultures are unequal by their development. They are just not equal. They have caste structures, they have class structures, they have gender inequalities. And so to achieve equality of opportunity means changing culture.
Not necessarily, but yes, reforming culture, I would say, yes.
Reforming culture?
Yeah.
How is reforming different?
I don't know. So that's why I say it has to be a process of co-production. I mean, at the end, the way I think of these processes are a sort of social movements of a micro social movements. Every village has one.
Every village has one?
Every village has to make the change happen in its own interests. Yeah, and of course, it's going to be a lot of politics that goes on about who wins and who loses from that process. But this is not going to happen from the top. When these projects work, is because they facilitate underprivileged communities to take actions that at the end give them more opportunity and more agency.
So to take a larger slice.
To take a larger slice, both of power, of symbolic space, and of material space. Yeah, that's how these equalizations happen at the end. And that's not an easy or slow, a fast process. So some work we've done in Bihar has found remarkable change happen because women's groups started doing that in rural Bihar because of an intervention that the government of Bihar did with the assistance of the bank called Jivika. And it's had these remarkable impacts.
So what kind of impacts has it had from that cultural perspective?
Yeah, so Bihar, remember, is one of India's poorest states, deeply caste-ridden and deeply patriarchal. In that context, Jivika at its best, Jivika now affects 13 million people. There's a lot of variation in what change it's able to make. But at its best, it was able to inculcate women's networks, develop women's networks in these villages that were able to work with each other to make gender relations more equal. Yeah, women are now running for election all over the place. They're running businesses. The current Bihar chief minister sees them as his constituency, which is very strange. And it's not caste anymore; it's gender. So
that's become the kind of new block-forming solidarity with gender instead of caste.
Yeah. And it's not like life is transformed into something wonderful for them. It's just that it's become more gender equal.
When you go into a place with an extreme inequality, for instance, an extreme gender inequality, and you try to co-produce that idea of what a good life would be or what those development goals should be, do you find that those ideas of the good life in the future are still deeply unequal in the same ways, or do they look beyond that?
Not in India. What's happening is, I think there's been a tremendous equalization in aspirations.
An equalization of aspirations.
Of aspirations. People wanting the same thing because of, I suppose everybody's looking at the same TV programs or whatever it is. But they all want the same things. You can go to slum after slum in India, you'll find parents wanting their kids to be doctors and lawyers. And you wonder, are these aspirations too high? Will they be able to achieve those goals, given the abject poverty in which they live?
What's at the root of that? Is it about making money? Is it about social position?
Both. To get out of poverty.
And access
to have
to
status.
Another world?
And access to another world and social status. Absolutely.
Do people aspire to high levels of indigenous Indian learning?
Not nearly as much. Indian anthropology has been subject to the yoke of a term called Sanskritization that was developed by M.N. Srinivas in 1962. It was all about that the way lower castes climb up in the world is by imitating upper castes. I just don't think that's true anymore. People are aspiring to far more prosaic things like professional occupations, dressing in a certain way. Every Indian village now has at least 2 or 3 quote-unquote beauty parlors. It's modernization of a particular kind. It's not, I don't want to get into modernization theory and development and all that, but it's a...
It feels like the aesthetics are really important. And I'm not just talking about a person's body, but the whole style of a person's life.
Yes.
To appear in a certain way.
To appear in a certain way, to be thought of in a certain way, to be not seen as an illiterate country bumpkin. That sort of change has happened. And parents want it for their children. On the other hand, you have all these poor farmers saving, making themselves bankrupt to send their kids to school. And the kids go to college and can't find jobs at the end that meet their expectations. They come back to the village and start their farming again or become, wage laborers.
Do you find a building sort of class resentment that comes out of that?
Oh, yeah.
Class resentment is a dominant story in countries like America right now.
I think there is a building class resentment that's coming out of that to some extent. There's certainly a lot of depression and drug use and alcoholism that's coming out of that.
So one of the buzzwords, I think you mentioned it in your talk earlier, was adaptive development. Do you find that projects are adapting to those new maladies like alcoholism and drug use?
No. Adaptation is not a new idea in development, right? It goes back to Albert Hirschman's Development Projects Observed, which is 1967. That is, it's 50 years old. Yeah. So, and
has it still not sunk in?
And it was a buzzword then, it's a buzzword now. The problem is not the idea. The problem is getting it done, which means you have to change how people behave. That is, they should be absolutely willing to look at good and bad news.
Which people's behavior are you talking about?
Oh, implementers.
Implementers.
So governments,
governments,
policymakers, that sort of person. Yeah. And adaptive development has got nothing to do with voice and agency. It's all about how bureaucracies function. Yeah. So I think it's important. But the question is, how do you do it? And that's what we've been trying to do with the Social Observatory for 7 years.
Is there a lack of agency within the bureaucracies?
In what sense?
What is it that prevents adaptation from happening?
Incentives. Nobody wants bad news. Everybody wants to package things in such a way that everybody thinks they're great at what they do. That goes right up to the top of a political system.
So nobody wants to be associated with a failure? With a failure.
And therefore, then if you don't be associated with a failure, how are you going to learn from failure? If you don't learn from failure, you're not adapting. You can't just adapt from success. A failure is something very specific in this adaptive language, which is basically that you did an intervention and it didn't work. That's why I call that paper anatomy of failure. You don't meet the expectations of what the project is supposed to do. And so then you figure out why that didn't happen. Maybe your goals were wrong. Maybe the way you implemented it was wrong. Whatever it was, you try to fix it the next time around. Yeah, that is how you adapt to failure. You learn from failure. Yeah, and that itself is a very hard task. This idea of co-production. I wish researchers and practitioners could co-produce their work. That's what in the Social Observatory that I started, we try to do. We sort of we call it embedded research. Like you have embedded reporters, with the army or something.
Embedded research.
It's embedded research. That is, researchers sitting with practitioners on a long-term basis, engaged in a dialogue with them, to both generate research questions and to feed back the results of that research to the practitioners. So that's a constant ongoing process of dialogue.
So there's a strong division between researchers and practitioners?
All over the world, yes. And researchers come in, fly in, do their work, fly out, write the papers.
Do they tend to be like academic people? They come from universities?
Typically academics,
consultancies,
yeah.
Or?
Yeah, it's typically academics,
yeah.
And which is fine. Academics have to do their thing too. And that's slowly changing, partly because of all this RCT stuff, which has gotten development economists to do a lot of their own surveys. 20 years ago, development economists typically didn't do their own surveys.
Where did they get their data from?
Secondary data that governments collected typically. Yeah, that has changed. A lot of original data collection is now happening. Very good survey work is happening. So that has changed. But still, I would prefer there to be a more ongoing dialogue between researchers and practitioners. This whole business of co-production, of dialogic development, of deliberative development, whatever you want to call it, I think that's where that needs to go. And that's, again, where anthropologists can play a very, very important role, because you guys understand the process of dialogue. You understand the process of giving the respondent a say in how they're presented and how they're understood.
Yeah, there's a real concern in anthropology as to who speaks for whom.
Yes, exactly. And that concern has to come into development.
And it's not there now?
No. Development is a unique enterprise, right? I mean, it's something nowhere else that I know of, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, in human history has there been a dedicated bunch of professionals and institutions devoted to making the world a better place. And a lot of money being spent on that.
My answer to that is it depends on your definition of better, because the Catholic Church would probably say they're an example.
Sure, but right, but let's say.
So we're dealing here with a particular definition of better and a theories of change as to how to achieve that.
And everybody has those biases.
Right.
Everybody in anthropology has those biases.
Absolutely.
Too, right. So true. But think of it this way: the Catholic Church thought they were making people better by saving them for God. Development professionals think they're making the world a better place by giving them agency or opportunity, right? Both. I'm going to throw myself in that mix, obviously. But it is in some ways, that sense, a very different enterprise, yeah? And we've had to rethink what the enterprise implies. And to me, the most significant piece of work that made us rethink that was 1967's Development Projects Observed, Albert Hirschman.
Albert Hirschman, Development Projects Observed?
Yes. It's a book I advocate that everybody in development should read, because what Hirschman did, he was told, to basically look at 20 World Bank projects or something and say what was wrong with them. And he said, what's wrong with them? There are two things. They work when they fail. Because what happens then is people get creative, and there's something called the hidden hand, his words, hidden hand that comes, that a creative solution to a problem that makes the project actually work. Yeah. So he was basically advocating adaptive change. I mean, and he says that. I mean, that's so that,
and also kind of experimentation,
and
right?
a kind of experimentation,
and openness to failure,
yeah,
and openness to the unexpected,
precisely,
unintended consequence.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, development is struggling with listening to Hirschman ever since then, yeah. And all this adaptive PDI stuff was the latest attempt in that direction. So I hope we get there, yeah. And to me, you will not get there if all this adaptive stuff is just about changing how bureaucracies work. Adaptation at the end has to involve the millions of people we are supposedly trying to help. They have to be part of the process. If that doesn't happen, this remains the kind of colonial enterprise. It has the hallmarks of similarities to colonial enterprise. The big difference between colonialism and development should be that quote-unquote beneficiaries are being facilitated to have a voice in how they're being quote-unquote helped. Yeah, that's where it has to go. And I think how you do that, where you do that from, how all that comes in, how you change processes to make that happen, how you institute institutional change to make that happen, that's where anthropologists could play a very, very important role. And they're not doing so.
They're not doing so.
No. Anthropologists are in the business of critique. Anthropologists are in the business of publishing books that tell everybody how smart they are and how good and wonderfully motivated they are by higher concerns, that everything that everybody else does is wrong and bullshit, right? Book after book after book that comes out that really gets my goat. Occasionally you have a gem like David Moss's book that you mentioned, or
any other gems you can think of?
Akhil Gupta's Red Tape.
Oh, that's a good one, yeah.
Arjuna Padre's anything he writes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're wonderful pieces of work, but they're critiques, right? And critiques are helpful. I mean, critiques are necessary.
They have a place.
They absolutely have a place. But only critique? Also give me something positive, Teach me how to do better design.
Yeah, well, I think what you describe as positive, as moving towards those goals of cultural change, go against sort of what anthropology is all about, that idea of non-intervention.
Which I think is a problem, yeah, because there are some things we all agree are not good. Domestic violence is not good, yeah. How do we make that not happen, yeah? We all agree that lower castes getting discriminated against on a regular basis is not good. How do we make that not happen?
So if there are some cultural values or some values such as that kind of equality or protection from violence that you feel are legitimate to spread to the entire world.
Absolutely. It's not just about people. It's not just about individuals. It's the social structure that makes it happen. How do we change those structures? That's activist change. Yeah, social activists have been doing it for ever since human beings were on the planet.
And so as an economist, you also feel like you're engaged in changing social structures as well?
I don't know if I am. I think I'm trying to be.
You're trying to be.
Yeah. So yes.
At the end of the day, do you feel like you're having an impact?
I have no idea. I feel I'm contributing to the processes by which these things are discussed. Like every other scholar, I wish more people would read my work. And the older I get, the more acutely aware I am of how small a dent any one of us makes. At the end, it's a collective enterprise. And again, just as they're fads about development, they're fads and ideas. But I really hope that at the end, all those fads and ideas on development result in that one goal, which is the co-production between people who are being helped and the people who are doing the helping in dialogue to make the world a better place. And I think we more or less are trying to be, we just don't know how.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Ian. It's been a great pleasure and nice to have a conversation with an anthropologist. I've not done it in a while.
Thanks.
Thanks.
That was it, me and Vijayendra Rao. Today's episode was produced by me, Ian Pollock, with help from Simon Theobald, Julia Brown, and Jodie Lee Tremboth. Our executive producer is me, Ian Pollock. Subscribe to the Familiar Strange podcast. You can find us on iTunes and all the other familiar places. And don't forget, leave us a rating and review with your likes, dislikes. It helps people find the show, and it helps us make the show better. You can find show notes, including a list of all the books and papers mentioned today, plus our blog about anthropology's role in the world at thefamiliarstrange.com. If you want to contribute to the blog or have anything to say to me or the other hosts of this program, email us at submissions@thefamiliarstrange.com, tweet at TFS Tweets, or look us up on Facebook and Instagram. Music by Pete Dabro. There's a link to his EP in the show notes. Special thanks to the whole team at Anthropod at Cultural Anthropology, plus Julia Miller, Will Grant, Maud Rowe, and Nick Tremboth. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep talking strange.